Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you, as always, for listening. This is part 6 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled The Liberty of All Mankind. So, hello everyone. I apologize that this episode is being released late. Last week, I decided to record this episode in 2 sessions to save my vocal cords, but before I was able to sit down and record the second half, I had to undergo emergency oral surgery. I'll spare you the details, but suffice it to say that I was in no state to talk into a microphone for an hour while I recovered. I'm sorry that I didn't exactly have a good way to communicate this to you, the listeners, but now that that's over with, I'm ready to get back on track. Part 7 of this series should be released on November 30th as per the original schedule. As for the finale of the Korean War series that was supposed to be released last week as well, that also had to be pushed back a bit. The episode is ready to be produced though, and I'm hoping to get it recorded and start working on editing it once I'm finished with this. With any luck, it'll be out in the next couple of weeks. Also, I'd like to take this opportunity to issue a quick correction. Previously, I pronounced the name of Lafayette's native province as Auvergne. I only just now have learned that it's pronounced Auvergne. My apologies for the mistake. Anyway, that's enough housekeeping for now, so let's start the show. In the previous episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, we covered the dramatic final act of the stage play that was the American War of Independence. We picked up the narrative in May 1780 with Lafayette's return to North America after having spent the past year on leave in France. At that time, the War of Independence had reached somewhat of a stalemate, at least in the North. The British had evacuated Philadelphia and withdrew to the Loyalist stronghold of New York City. During his time back home, Lafayette had lobbied the French government to send a new expeditionary force to America, with the hope that the arrival of more French troops would help the Americans break this stalemate. When the forces under General Rochambeau finally arrived in July, the Americans were disheartened to learn that they received only half of the men that had been promised them. There was little for them to do but sit idle while the remainder of the force made its way across the Atlantic. In January 1781, Lafayette's prolonged state of inactivity came to an end, when General Washington entrusted him with a highly important mission. Benedict Arnold, who had betrayed the Americans in dramatic fashion the previous year, suddenly re-emerged in Virginia, leading a British army carrying out raids on American positions and generally being a thorn in Washington's side. Lafayette was selected to lead a force into the region and hunt down the traitor. By the summer, Lafayette found himself deep in the Virginia wilderness, facing supply shortages and receiving infrequent communication from his superiors. In May, Arnold was relieved of his command and replaced by General Charles Cornwallis, one of the most skillful British generals of the war. With Arnold eluding his grasp and unsure how to proceed, Lafayette asked permission to rejoin the main army in New Jersey as they prepared for the final assault on New York City, but, unbeknownst to him, Washington had decided on a different strategy, one that involved defeating Cornwallis in the South. Lafayette and his men were to play a central role in this new strategy, and in the months that followed, Lafayette constantly evaded Cornwallis's attempts to force him into open battle, all the while keeping his adversary occupied and buying Washington time to move his army into position. By September, Lafayette had managed to turn the tables on Cornwallis entirely, trapping his army at Yorktown, Virginia. On September 28th, a joint French and American force initiated a siege of Yorktown, and by October 19th, Lord Cornwallis surrendered unconditionally. The surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown was widely understood to mark the end of the War of Independence. The British, unwilling to continue the war effort, were expected to sue for peace in short order. With major military operations concluded, Lafayette was granted indefinite leave by Congress and was allowed to return home. In December, after tearfully bidding farewell to the land and the people that he had come to love so dearly, Lafayette set off once more for home, arriving in France in mid-January. 3 days later, on January 21st, 1782, he returned to the Hôtel de Noailles in Paris, and immediately embraced his 2 children, Anastasie and George Washington, then aged 5 and 3 years old, respectively. At the moment, his wife Adrienne was not home. She was attending festivities being held in honor of the newborn son of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Word of Lafayette's return quickly reached the Hôtel de Ville, the location of the royal gala. Adrienne was ecstatic about her husband's return, but social convention prohibited her from leaving the gathering before the Queen did. Graciously, Marie Antoinette not only granted Adrienne permission to leave, but offered to give her a ride home in one of her own carriages. Rushing to the Hôtel de Neuilly, along with practically the entire royal cortege, Adrienne found her husband, still adorned in his officer's uniform, awaiting her. One anonymous eyewitness described the scene that followed. Quote, Marie Antoinette congratulated him warmly on his victories and safe return. Then she delivered his wife to him down the carriage steps to the cheers and applause of the onlookers. Trembling and faint with joy, Adrienne fell into her knight's arms and he carried her into the house. End quote. The day after his return, Lafayette was summoned to pay a visit to the Palace of Versailles. There, the king conferred upon him the rank of Marshal de Camp in the French army, the closest equivalent to his American rank of Major General. He was also inducted into the Order of Saint Louis, the highest military honor that the King of France could bestow. Some sources claim that at this time he was granted the title Conqueror of Cornwallis, though I have been unable to confirm whether this was actually done. Regardless, Lafayette would, as he made his social rounds in the following weeks, find himself the object of practically the entire kingdom's adulation. Everywhere he went, he was met with cheers of "Long live Lafayette." He was without a doubt the most popular man in France at that moment, unsurpassed in renown by any of his other countrymen who had participated in the war, Rochambeau, de Grasse, and so on. Of his warm welcome, Lafayette told Washington, quote, "The reception I have met with from the nation at large, from the king and from my friends will, I am sure, be pleasing to you and has surpassed my utmost ambition." End quote. One person Lafayette made doubly certain to call upon at this time was Benjamin Franklin, American ambassador to France. Before departing America, Congress had entrusted Lafayette with the task of securing further financial assistance from France. They had previously delegated this mission to Franklin, but he was growing old and arthritic. He was no longer capable of making the carriage ride from his residence near Paris to Versailles without great pain. Lafayette was more than happy to take on the role of the ambassador's representative, traveling to and from Versailles and carrying out negotiations on his behalf. Lafayette claimed that, quote, "The footing I am upon at court enables me to go at times to greater lengths than could be done by a foreigner." End quote. He demonstrated this by requesting a loan of 12 million livres for the Americans, which was a significantly greater sum than they'd requested, and subsequently talking them down back to the original amount of 6 million. Franklin was greatly appreciative of Lafayette's assistance, writing to Washington, quote, "We are on the most friendly and confidential footing with each other, and he is really quite serviceable to me in my applications for additional assistance. The Marquis de Lafayette was, at his return hither, received by all ranks with all possible distinction. He daily gains in general esteem and affection, and promises to be a great man here." End quote. After Lafayette managed to secure the loan Congress had asked him to, a new set of diplomatic tasks lay before him. As I alluded to in the previous episode, the American victory at Yorktown, decisive as it was, did not necessarily spell the end of the War of Independence. Even with the surrender of Cornwallis's entire army, the British still held firmly on to New York City and a few other strategically important cities, including Savannah and Charleston. Militarily speaking, they were in a position to continue the war if they desired, but there were other factors at play. By the time of the Battle of Yorktown, the war in North America had been going on for over 6 years. The war effort had become largely unpopular with the general public in Great Britain, who had come to believe that it was no longer worth the cost. With Cornwallis's surrender, continuing the war now seemed utterly pointless. Upon receiving the news, the British Prime Minister, Lord North, is said to have repeatedly exclaimed, quote, "Oh God, it's all over." End quote. 5 months later, Parliament passed a measure to end the war in North America, and Lord North was subsequently forced out of office by a vote of no confidence. A new government took office with a mandate to negotiate a peace treaty. The proceedings were scheduled to begin in Paris in April of 1782. Great Britain was to be represented by David Hartley, a member of Parliament for Kingston upon Hull, and Richard Oswald, a Scottish merchant and economic advisor to the previous government. Curiously, though not exactly relevant to the matter at hand, Oswald had made the greater part of his fortune in the slave trade, while Hartley was a prominent early proponent of abolitionism. The American delegation initially consisted of John Jay, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, with Franklin in the role of chief negotiator. They would later be joined by Henry Lawrence after he was released from British custody in exchange for the release of Lord Cornwallis. Lafayette, though not officially party to the talks, expected to play a role in the process on account of the fact that Congress had instructed all American diplomats abroad to, quote, confer with the Marquis de Lafayette and avail themselves of his information relative to the situation of public affairs in the United States, end quote. Prior to the start of these negotiations, the father of Lafayette's friend, Ségur, the Marquis de Ségur, offered him some words of warning. Quote, you will see that there are as many absurdities in diplomatic negotiations as there are in military campaigns. You will be more revolted than ever by English pride, Spanish vanity, French inconsistency, and by despotic ignorance. But the more obstacles you cross, the greater merit you will deserve, end quote. It was not long before Lafayette came to understand exactly what he meant. It became apparent that the British did not intend to secure a peace agreement as quickly as possible, but rather they intended to stall the negotiations while attempting to sow division between the Americans and their European allies. According to the terms of the 1778 Treaty of Alliance between the United States and France, neither party was to sign a separate peace agreement with Great Britain, and British recognition of American independence was a necessary precondition to any such agreement. Oswald met privately with the delegates from both countries, warning them not to trust the other. France's foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, openly rebuffed the British proposal for a separate treaty, stating, quote, France would never treat without her allies, end quote. Adams' response was similar, stating that, quote, nothing could be done but in concert with France, end quote. Still, the British continued dragging their feet in recognizing American independence, and the negotiations went nowhere for months on end. One day, Lafayette voiced his frustration to one of Oswald's aides, saying, quote, I see that the expectation of peace is a joke, and that you only amuse us without any real intention of treating, end quote. In July, the British Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham, died of influenza, necessitating a shuffling of the cabinet and the temporary suspension of the negotiations. Lafayette decided to take advantage of this lull in the activity to attend properly to his personal affairs, by which I mean he resolved to spend more time with his family. Upon returning to France in January, he came to the upsetting realization that he had been absent for practically all of his children's lives. In a letter he wrote to Washington in January, he reported, quote, both my daughter and my son are grown up so much that I find myself a great deal older than I apprehended, end quote. As for his wife, Adrienne, she was happy to spend time with him again after having been separated for the better part of the last 5 years, and what's more, was greatly relieved after having spent that entire period positively racked with anxiety over her husband's well-being. According to her daughter, it took her some time to overcome these feelings, as she reports that for several months after Lafayette's return, Adrienne would become faint with worry every time he so much as left the room, for fear that she would never see him again. As she writes, quote, she was terrified of this strong passion, at the idea that she would be unable to hide it from my father and that it would become embarrassing, end quote. Adrienne became pregnant again in the first months of that year, and with another child on the way, Lafayette decided that it was time to move his family from his in-laws' residence and into a home of their own. In September, he turned 25, the legal age of majority in France at that time, meaning that he would finally be allowed unfettered access to all of his financial assets. It was at this time that he purchased a mansion in Paris for a total of 150,000 livres. It was located on the Rue de Bourbon, now called the Rue de Lille. Just across the Seine River was the Tuileries Palace, the Parisian residence of the monarch, and just down the street to the west lay the Palais Bourbon, the building complex that today serves as the meeting place of the French National Assembly. Next door was the home of disgraced former Minister of Finance and Robert Jacques Turgot, who had died a year prior. We'll have cause to talk about him more in the next episode. The Hôtel de Lafayette was demolished at an indeterminate point in the early 20th century, but Turgot's residence, which was designed by the same architect in a similar style and constructed around the same time, can give us an idea of what Lafayette's house looked like, if only in terms of its structure. The following description comes from Auricchio's book, The Marquis Lafayette Reconsidered. Quote, both houses were built in a horseshoe arrangement, framing a common entry court, and were laid out in a similar style. The building was large enough to accommodate Lafayette's family and their household servants in a manner befitting their station, but compared with other homes in the area, it was not out of the ordinary. The house's primary living quarters were distributed across 2 floors with 6 rooms per floor, augmented by a partial balcony level, a basement, and an attic. Household servants had quarters in the attic, and additional servants were housed in an outbuilding. The stables, too, were ample, able to hold 15 horses and 4 carriages. The social hub of the Lafayette household was an airy oval salon on the ground floor, featuring 3 sets of doors that opened onto a garden." End quote. The interior of the home was decorated primarily with furniture in what art historians refer to as the Louis XV style, a style characterized by lightness, delicacy, and ornate decoration, and its use of classical Roman and Greek motifs. Amidst these furnishings, which were more or less typical of the French nobility at the time, were interspersed several mementos from America. This included several American flags draped on the walls, a framed portrait of George Washington, a mural depicting scenes from the War of Independence, and a number of houseplants native to the New World, such as ginseng. The artisanally crafted mahogany shelves of Lafayette's private study were lined with English-language books on the subject of American politics, including works by Jefferson and Adams. This room also held one of his proudest possessions, a copy of the American Declaration of Independence engraved in gold lettering. When he commissioned this facsimile of the document, he explained, quote, "The object of my wanting a Declaration of Independence is that when I wish to put myself in good spirits, I will look at it and most voluptuously read it over." End quote. Directly next to it sat an empty frame in which Lafayette often said that he hoped to display a copy of the French Declaration of Rights. In addition to the 150,000 livres he spent on the house itself and the surrounding property, Lafayette sunk an additional 100,000 livres into renovations and 50,000 on furnishing, bringing the total cost to 300,000 livres, equivalent to a staggering $3 million in today's currency. This massive investment would mark the beginning of a perennial financial headache for Lafayette. Within 3 years, his expenses would outgrow his income, and the problem would only continue to worsen over time. To be fair, though, it's worth pointing out that this sort of financial mismanagement was commonplace among the noble class in France, and as we'll see in the next episode, this problem actually extended to the highest echelons of government as well. On September 17th, Adrienne gave birth to the couple's 3rd surviving child, the 4th overall, counting the deceased Henriette. Adrienne wished to give her new daughter the name of a Christian saint, that is, Marie, while Lafayette insisted on naming her after one of the United States, namely Virginia. Both of them did agree that it would be appropriate to give their daughter a name honoring the Queen, and so the compromise they arrived at was Marie Antoinette Virginie Dumotier. Lafayette elaborated on his rationale in a letter to Benjamin Franklin, quote, "Every child of mine that comes to light is a small addition to the growing number of American citizens. I have the pleasure to inform you that although she was but 7 months advanced, Madame de Lafayette has this morning become the mother of a daughter who, however delicate in her beginning, enjoys perfect health, and I hope will soon grow equal to the hardiest of children. This reminds me of our noble revolution, into which we were forced sooner than it ought to have begun, but our strength came on quickly, and overall, I think we did at least as well as any other people. They asked me what name my daughter should have. I want to present her as an offering to my other country, and as there is not a good saint by the name of Virginia, I was thinking, if it was not presuming too much, to let her bear a name similar to that of one of the United States." End quote. Franklin replied in his typical fashion, quote, "In naming your children, I think you do well to begin with the most ancient of the states, and as we cannot have too many of so good a race, I hope that you and Madame de Lafayette will go through all 13. While you are proceeding, I do hope that some of our states will rename themselves. Miss Virginia, Miss Carolina, and Miss Georgia will sound pretty enough for the girls, but Massachusetts and Connecticut are too harsh even for the boys, unless they were to be savages." End quote. On account of the difficulty of Adrienne's pregnancy, newborn Virginie would be the final addition to the family. To return to the subject of diplomacy, Lafayette from the beginning had been skeptical of Britain's desire for peace. Writing in a letter to Washington in January, quote, "England is determined to play a desperate game and to try at least another campaign. Whether it will be a defensive one in America and offensive elsewhere, or the reverse of that, I cannot yet ascertain. But I think the evacuation of New York and Charleston is as far from their mind for the next campaign as the evacuation of London, and to get out of it, they must be driven." End quote. Lafayette was feeling rather pessimistic after 3 months of fruitless negotiations. He offered his assessment of the diplomatic situation in a letter to Robert Livingston, the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, dated June 25th. Quote, "From the very beginning, Mr. Adams has been persuaded that the British ministry was not sincere, that the greater part of them were equally as against America as any in the old administration, and that all these negotiations were not much to be depended upon. His judgment in this affair has been confirmed by events." End quote. He went on in this letter to explicate his idea that further military action was needed to stop the British in their obstruction of the peace process. Quote, "A good army in America would do more to bring peace than one can imagine. The King of England is more irritated than humiliated, and it is thus necessary to convince him firmly of the impossibility of conquering us. If this next campaign is victorious, it will certainly be the last." End quote. Prime Minister Vergennes agreed with Lafayette on this matter, but at that moment, France could not afford to send another large expeditionary force to America. Still, something had to be done, he thought. So he called on France's ally, Spain, to join forces against Britain once more. Their strategy involved first dislocating the British from their stronghold of Gibraltar on the southernmost point of the Iberian Peninsula. From there, they would sail across the Atlantic to seize British colonial possessions in the Caribbean, most importantly Jamaica, before turning north to attack British holdouts at Charleston. Very much tempted at the prospect of taking Jamaica for themselves, the Spanish agreed to the plan. In autumn 1782, a Franco-Spanish armada began assembling at the Spanish port city of Cadiz. It was to include 66 ships of the line and transport sufficient to carry 25,000 infantry, which would have made it significantly larger than the famed Spanish Armada of 1588. The Comte d'Estaing was appointed commander of the naval forces, while Lafayette was selected to lead the ground troops. Upon learning that Lafayette was to lead the invasion of Jamaica, the King of Spain, Charles III, allegedly objected to the appointment, crying out loud, quote, "No, I do not want him there. He will turn it into a republic." End quote. Lafayette secured the appointment despite the old king's protest, although from his correspondence, it is apparent that his sights were set ultimately not on Jamaica, but Canada. Eager as ever to deliver New France from the clutches of England, Lafayette traveled to Cadiz in late November to join the Armada, which was already blockading the British at Gibraltar. Scarcely had he set out for Spain when, on November 30th, the United States and Great Britain signed a preliminary peace agreement. At first glance, it would seem that the British felt sufficiently threatened by the massive expeditionary force being assembled in Spain that they opted to concede to the Americans. The reality of the diplomatic situation, though, was a bit more complex. Months prior, while the talks in Paris were still recessed, Jay and Adams began negotiating with the British directly. Crucially, they did not consult with the French in doing this, but it was in this way that several of the more contentious issues standing in the way of an agreement, especially regarding the boundaries of the United States, were resolved. By November, with the Armada scheduled to depart in a month, the British, once more trying to split up the two allies, suggested to the American diplomats that the French army that was soon to be heading to the New World may not have the best interests of the United States in mind. They may, for instance, attempt to re-establish French rule in Canada, which was something neither the Americans nor British thought desirable. Both Adams and Jay distrusted the French and were anxious to minimize French influence on the United States. As Jay explained in a letter to Secretary Livingston, quote, "They are interested in separating us from Great Britain, and on that point we may, I believe, depend on them. But it is not in their interest that we should become a great and formidable nation, and therefore they will not help us to become so." End quote. Lafayette had just reached Cadiz when he received news of the preliminary agreement between the United States and Britain in January 1783. From his correspondence, it appears he still had his heart set on leading the expedition, but these hopes were definitively put to rest on the 20th, when France and Spain begrudgingly made preliminary peace agreements with Britain as well. The expedition was called off, and the Armada was anticlimactically disbanded. Lafayette may have been disappointed at missing this opportunity, but if he was, he evinced no sign of it in his writings. He also may have been disappointed at the conduct of his American friends, but regardless, the most important thing was that a conclusive end to the war was finally in sight. Lafayette asked Admiral d'Estaing if he could take the fastest ship he had across the Atlantic to bring this news to America in person, but before this could be arranged, he received a message from William Carmichael, who was acting as John Jay's charge d'affaires in Madrid while the ambassador was out of the country on business. Carmichael told Lafayette that the Spanish government refused to recognize American independence and would not honor his request to meet with them. Since the United States bordered Spanish colonies to the south and west, diplomatic recognition from Spain was crucial to securing American sovereignty. Lafayette jumped at the opportunity to help, writing in his reply to Carmichael, quote, "On the happy prospect of peace, I'd prepared to go to America. Never did an idea please me so much as the hope to rejoice with those to whom I have been a companion in our labors. But however painful the delay, I must now defer my departure. In the discharge of my duty to America, no sacrifice shall ever be wanting. And when it had pleased Congress to direct their ministers to consult with me, it became my first concern to deserve their confidence." End quote. In the first week of February, Lafayette dispatched an aide to travel to America in his place, bearing messages from him congratulating his friends across the ocean for their success, and updating them on the diplomatic situation. His message to Washington, dated February 5th, reads in part, quote, "My dear General, I rejoice at the blessings of peace where our noble ends have finally been secured. Remember our Valley Forge times, and from a recollection of past dangers and labors, we will be more pleased with our present comfortable situation. What a sense of pride and satisfaction I feel when I think of the times that determined my engaging in the American cause. As for you, my dear General, who can truly say you have done all this? What must your virtuous and good heart feel on this happy instant, where the revolution you have made is now firmly established?" End quote. The Marquis arrived in the Spanish capital on February 15th, confident that they would not treat him as dismissively as they had the Americans. Making a point to wear his American general's uniform, he was granted an audience by the king, Charles III, who received him with all due honors. He spoke with the king briefly on the subject of America, as he described in his report to Secretary Livingston, quote, "In the course of our conversation, I could see that American independence gives some umbrage to the Spanish. They fear the loss of their colonies, and the success of our revolution appears to be encouragement to this fear. Upon this subject, the king has odd notions, as he has indeed upon everything." End quote. In the next 2 weeks, Lafayette met several times with Spain's foreign minister, the Count de Floridablanca, to discuss the matter at greater length. The most contentious issue was, again, the boundary between the United States and Spain's colonies, namely Florida and the territory of Louisiana, which the Spanish had controlled since 1762. Lafayette reported that Floridablanca knew very little about North America in general and displayed obstinacy during their talks, but after 2 weeks of meetings, he felt he had made some headway. He was able to persuade the minister to accept Carmichael's credentials, and he received assurances that Spain would extend recognition to the United States in due course. He summarized his diplomatic mission as follows, quote, "Never was a man further from a partiality for Spain than I am, but I think I have now left them with a sincere and steady intention to cultivate the friendship of America. They labor under fits of occasional madness, they have an ill-conducted pride, and it is disagreeable to treat with them. Their own interest does not persuade them out of their prejudices, but though they had rather there was not such a place as North America, they are truly and earnestly desirous to maintain good harmony and live in friendship with the United States." End quote. True to their word, Spain recognized the independence of the United States on February 17th, a development that Carmichael was more than happy to attribute to Lafayette's, quote, "zeal and ardor which influences him when the presence of the United States are in question." End quote. Not everyone was quite as pleased with this development as Carmichael, namely John Adams. In a letter to an associate of his in Massachusetts, he expressed resentment regarding the undue influence Lafayette had been allowed in the diplomatic affairs of the United States. Quote, "The instruction of Congress to their foreign ministers to consult with him was very ill-judged. It was lowering themselves and their servants. There is no American minister who would not already have been willing to consult with him, but to make it a duty is a humiliation that would astonish the world were it to be known. Our ministers will never be respected, never have any influence, while they continue to be depressed in this manner." End quote. Ever wary of France, Adams was concerned that if and when the interests of France and the United States conflicted, Lafayette's loyalty could not be counted upon. Quote, "He is connected with a family of great influence in France. He rises fast in the army. He may soon be in the ministry. This mongrel character of French patriot and American patriot cannot exist for long, and if hereafter it should be in the interest of the French court to break our union, imagination could not conceive of a more proper instrument for that purpose than the Marquis." End quote. Throughout the latter half of the year 1782, as the remaining British forces prepared to withdraw from their final strongholds in the country, and as the American army closed in on them, a series of skirmishes took place in the south. These were small-scale actions that would be of little note, save for the fact that one of these claimed the life of one of Lafayette's dearest friends. John Laurens, a native of South Carolina, had spent several months keeping tabs on British troop movements in and around Charleston. On August 27th, his scouts spotted a detachment of British soldiers who had been sent out from the city to forage for supplies. Eager to rush into battle, Laurens quickly ordered a cavalry charge and was shot in the process, falling mortally wounded from his horse. Washington broke the news to Lafayette in a letter that reached him in October. Quote, "Poor Laurens is no more. He fell in a trifling skirmish in South Carolina, attempting to prevent the enemy from plundering the country." End quote. Laurens' penchant for unnecessarily exposing himself to physical danger was well known, and now, finally, mere weeks before the official cessation of hostilities, Laurens had been granted the death in battle he seems to have always desired. In his life, Laurens had displayed great zeal not just in battle, but in his commitment to the abolitionist cause. Historians of the period, and indeed even contemporary observers, made a note of the fact that many leading American revolutionaries, despite their espousal of the rhetoric of liberty, were slave owners. John's own father, former president of the Continental Congress and prominent slave trader and owner Henry Laurens, was a prime example of this American hypocrisy. Nonetheless, the younger Laurens believed fully in the American cause, as demonstrated by his final sacrifice. At the same time, he understood that the promise of the American project would never be truly realized until slavery was abolished, and during the war he had worked to bring about this goal by using the means available to him. When the British shifted their strategic focus to the south, they found ready and willing allies in slaves who had escaped captivity from their American masters, and who were offered freedom if they enlisted with the British Army. One of Laurens' longest-held ambitions was to win these former slaves over to the American cause. Time and again, Laurens petitioned Congress to allow him to recruit former slaves with the same sorts of promises that had been offered to them by the British, and, time and again, these requests were rejected out of hand. Once the war had concluded, Laurens planned to continue his anti-slavery activism to help resolve the great contradiction at the heart of the American project. Lafayette was greatly affected by the untimely death of his friend and comrade, and it appears that with his death, he resolved to take up the cause that his dearly departed friend Laurens had so ardently believed in. And so, it was around this time that Lafayette became an abolitionist. Prior to 1782, Lafayette had not voiced any strong opinions on the matter of slavery one way or the other. On occasions where he did make reference to slaves or slavery in his correspondence, he seemed to regard slavery as a simple fact of life, and the slaves themselves he appeared to regard as being in the same category as any other kind of property, like livestock. Now, with this change of heart, Lafayette had begun to formulate a scheme by which he hoped to gradually bring about an end to the institution. He outlined his plans in a letter he sent to Washington from Cadiz shortly after the preliminary peace agreement was signed. Quote, "Permit me to propose to you a plan which might become greatly beneficial to the black part of mankind. Let us unite in purchasing a small estate where we may try an experiment to free the Negroes and use them only as tenants. Such an example as yours might render it a general practice, and if we succeed in America, I will cheerfully devote part of my time to render the method fashionable in the West Indies. If it is a wild scheme, I had rather be mad in that way than thought to be wise on the other track." End quote. Ever since he departed America in 1781, Lafayette ruminated about what the Revolution had meant. What did the words of the Declaration of Independence mean when it said, quote, "All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." End quote. When he first traveled to the New World, he had only a vague notion of these concepts. He was less concerned by these abstract, heady notions and more with the prospect of winning fame and glory. By embracing abolitionism, Lafayette was bringing the underlying logic of the American Revolution to its natural conclusion. This conclusion was, for Lafayette, easy enough to arrive at, given that the institution of slavery was not one that, to him, had a huge impact on his daily life. His dear friend Washington, on the other hand, was one of the largest slave owners in the United States. The profits generated by slave labor had made him immensely wealthy, and it was, in part because of this wealth, that he had been invited to take on such a prominent role in the revolutionary leadership. To his credit, Washington was not an unintelligent man. He was no doubt capable of recognizing the great contradiction at the heart of the revolutionary project. At the same time, he must also have been capable of recognizing the fact that taking steps towards the abolition of slavery, which was well within his ability to do, would have entailed the diminishing of his own wealth and status, hence why he was hesitant to weigh in strongly on the debate. Washington's response to Lafayette was rather diplomatic. Quote, "This scheme, my dear Marquis, which you propose as a precedent to encourage the emancipation of black people in this country from the state of bondage in which they are held, is striking evidence of the benevolence of your heart. I shall be happy to join you in such laudable work, but will defer into the details of this business until I have the pleasure of seeing you again." End quote. These were empty words, however, intended simply to spare his protégé's feelings. Washington never made good on this promise. In March 1783, Lafayette left Spain, deciding to return to Paris by way of Chavagnac, his first visit to his birthplace in over a decade. Of the three women who had more or less raised him, his grandmother and two aunts, Charlotte and Madeleine, only his Aunt Charlotte remained. Even his cousin Marie, who was like a sister to him, had died a year after he left for America. In a letter to Adrienne, Lafayette described his aunt's reaction upon seeing him for the first time in so many years. Quote, "The first moment was terrible for her. Her cries, her anguish were terrifying. Finally, little by little, she has cheered up immensely since my arrival. She has changed and aged terribly, but she has regained a little strength now and spends the day out of her bedroom and comes to the table to eat. Since my arrival, the house is full of people, and she keeps busy by receiving them and doing the honors." End quote. Observing his native Auvergne, Lafayette saw a region suffering from the combined effects of a poor harvest and unusually harsh winter conditions. The people, his subjects, many of whom he had known personally since childhood, were freezing and starving. They lined up in droves to speak with their lord, begging him for food, clothing, shelter, and other essentials they lacked. He was deeply moved by the plight of the people of his home province and swore to do all that was in his power to help them. Upon meeting with some local officials, he learned that his own estate's granaries were, despite the poor harvest, still very much full of wheat and rye. One of the estate's overseers advised him to sell the excess grain. After all, now that there was such a high demand for it, now was the time to sell, ideally at a higher rate, and reap the profits. Lafayette rebuffed the official, proclaiming, quote, "No, now is the best time to give it all away." End quote. He would not countenance profiting off of other people's need, and ordered his grain reserves to be distributed en masse to the starving inhabitants of Auvergne. Lafayette's selfless decision here alleviated the conditions in the province, and his reputation among the locals was enhanced accordingly. Where once Lafayette had been seen as somewhat of an absentee landlord to the inhabitants of his home province, he was now a beloved hero to them. Adrienne, as the executor of Lafayette's estate, did what she could to assist the people, too. She helped to organize a new school in the region to teach the peasants how to weave raw wool into cloth, in the hopes that this knowledge would help them enrich themselves over time. Lafayette was, of course, greatly appreciative of his wife's efforts on behalf of his subjects. Upon his return to Paris in May, Lafayette, along with Adrienne and his three children, moved into their new residence on the Rue de Bourbon. 4 months later, on September 3rd, at the Hôtel de York, less than a mile away, the representatives of Britain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris, recognizing American independence and formally ending the war. Simultaneously, in Versailles, peace treaties were also signed by representatives of Spain and France. King Louis XVI, to commemorate the occasion, declared a public holiday, called the Festival of Peace. The following description of the celebrations comes from Weitzman's book. Quote, "The aristocracy celebrated by throwing masked balls, extravagant dinners, and gala soirees at the theaters. The first hot air balloons were sent soaring over Paris. The king offered free food and wine in the public squares, and massive bonfires were lit across the city." End quote. The conclusion of the peace treaty, this final triumph of the revolution, also sparked renewed enamorment among French society with all things American. As historian Simon Schama posits in his book, Citizens, A Chronicle of the French Revolution, the affinity of the French upper and middle classes for the American cause was to a degree superficial, as evidenced by the great number of expensive tapestries and commemorative medallions produced at the time. To many, it was nothing more than a passing trend. Schama compares it to Italian operas and British novels. We'll talk more about the ways in which the American Revolution had a genuine influence on French politics in the next episode as we discuss the run-up to the French Revolution, but for the time being, what I will say is that no one in France appears to have embraced the American cause more enthusiastically than Lafayette. And nowhere can his attempts to reconcile this acceptance of the liberal notions upon which the American project was based and the realities of his position in France's social class system be observed more closely than in his social life. Take, for instance, the way in which he decorated his new house, with an eclectic mix of opulent furniture based on the latest styles from Versailles, and mementos commemorating the American Revolution. On the subject of his social life, Lafayette turned his home on the Rue de Bourbon into a social hub for the burgeoning American expatriate community in Paris. Chez Lafayette functioned almost like an unofficial consulate, where American citizens could go to seek information, employment, legal or financial assistance, or to establish social contacts with each other and the French officials, businessmen and noblemen, and various other figures of interest who were also frequent visitors to the residence. Every Monday night, Lafayette and his wife received guests in their salon. For the most part, Adrienne handled the organizational side of things, sending out the invitations, determining the menu, and moderating the conversations. By all accounts, she demonstrated herself to be a very capable hostess. Benjamin Franklin was a regular fixture at these weekly events, as was Thomas Jefferson after he was sent on a diplomatic assignment to Paris by Congress in 1784. John Adams was also a frequent guest, which I'm sure sounds strange, given that he'd been very critical of Lafayette in the past. People who were close to Adams attest that he had a very mercurial temperament, and it's reasonable to conclude that Lafayette fell victim to one of his many bouts of moodiness, during which he had a tendency to lash out at others irrationally. Adams did have legitimate misgivings about Lafayette's divided loyalties, even if events demonstrated that Lafayette consistently supported the American position wherever their dealings with France were concerned, but these concerns were outweighed by his disdain for French culture in general. Lafayette's sensibilities had become so thoroughly Americanized that even the puritanical Adams found his residence on the Rue de Bourbon to be a welcome refuge from the spectacle and extravagance that characterized day-to-day life in the French capital. There were no late-night soirees, high-stakes card games, or anything else of the sort, only prolonged, heady discussions which were conducted primarily in English. Even the manners and dress of Lafayette and his family were less formal than one might expect of them based on their social status. In 1784, Abigail Adams, wife of John, moved to Paris along with their 19-year-old daughter, also named Abigail, and became another frequent guest at Lafayette's residence. Abigail shared her husband's distaste for France and its culture, and similarly regarded Lafayette and his family in a more positive light. Her remarks about Adrienne are, I believe, particularly instructive. The following comes from a letter Abigail wrote to her sister dated April 15, 1785. Quote, "I should always take pleasure in her company. She is a good and amiable lady, exceedingly fond of her children and attentive to their education, and passionately attached to her husband. Imagine that, a Frenchwoman, and fond of her husband." End quote. This last point she thought so noteworthy that she felt the need to reiterate it twice. Her daughter, the younger Abigail, expressed similar admiration for Adrienne, writing, quote, "The Marquise is a middle-sized lady. Sprightly, she speaks English with a tolerable ease and professes great attachment to America. She received us very civilly and cordially, and very politely apologized for not waiting on us first. She is very agreeable and pleasant." End quote. To bookend our discussion of this particular topic, I think it's worth mentioning that some historians have suggested that Lafayette's full-throated embrace of American identity was insincere in some way, that he was trying to prove something to his detractors and that he may have overdone it in the process. Writing in the 1930s, biographer W.E. Woodward posits that Lafayette's fault was not born of insincerity, but rather what he characterizes as an indecisiveness, born of an inability to reconcile his convictions with his actual lived experiences to form a coherent worldview. Quote, "He was by birth, by instinct, and by training a grand seigneur of France. He was too high in rank to come into personal contact with peasants and workmen. All of his dealings with the lower classes were carried out through intermediaries. Then, in his youth, he came to America, and he was stirred to the bottom of his soul by the brave resistance of the colonials against the mighty British Empire. As an ardent fighter in the revolutionary struggle, he acquired a fairly complete set of Republican ideals. Then, upon his return to France, he resumed his place in the traditional pattern of aristocratic life. He did all that a distinguished noble like himself was meant to do. He lived in spacious luxury, attended the dances and galas at Versailles, and spent his time in the salons of the great houses. And yet, all this time, he was attempting to reconcile his Republican notions with this aristocratic tradition, an attempt that was inherently impossible." End quote. To backtrack a bit, the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 inspired a new round of public accolades for Lafayette. He was hailed as Washington's savior and America's liberator. It was around this time that he was first dubbed the Hero of Two Worlds, by whom, originally it is unknown, but the appellation stuck with him for the rest of his life. An almost superhuman set of qualities were ascribed to him, with one author describing him in terms that one might see in a children's story, as, quote, an unsullied hero of the purest motives and rarest wisdom, defying evil men and cruel times in the cause of truth and reason, end quote. Contemporary authors likened him to the heroes of classical antiquity, like Achilles and Scipio Africanus. He was not without his detractors, though. The Duc de Choiseul, a prominent member of the diplomatic corps, once referred to him as Jules Caesar, a comparison that would only become more apt in the future. For all of his virtues, one that Lafayette lacked, at least in this stage of his life, was humility. He reveled in the fame, the attention, and the accolades. All of it definitely went to his head, as it probably would have with anyone at his age, and to his credit, he did try to use this influence to advance causes that he cared about. Lafayette never stopped advocating for American interests in France. He passionately took up the cause of American merchants trying to sell their wares in the country. Before the war, American exports had to be shipped first to Britain, where various taxes, levies, and fees were imposed before they could go to market. Now that they were independent, they were free to conduct their business across the globe as they pleased, at least in theory. Lafayette was scandalized to learn that the French government maintained similar restraints on American trade as Britain had. He began lobbying the French government to relax these restrictions and advocated for free trade, which was a relatively novel idea at the time. He wrote a letter to Prime Minister Vergennes, which read in part, quote, I cannot repeat too often that after a great war and a beautiful peace, it would be ridiculous to lose the fruit of so much blood and treasure, and all of that only to please a small class of people who themselves please no one, end quote. During this time, Lafayette, entering the lively world of political debate for the first time, authored a pamphlet entitled Observations on Commerce between France and the United States, and this tract, while by no means groundbreaking, was nonetheless well received and established a reputation for Lafayette as an enlightened champion of liberal ideas. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. On January 14th, 1784, the Treaty of Paris was ratified by the United States of America. Copies of the document were subsequently dispatched to both Paris and London, with the French government ratifying the treaty in March of that year and the British following suit in April. As all this was transpiring, Lafayette was in the midst of planning a trip back to the United States. It had been nearly 7 years since he had first set foot in the country, and throughout that entire time he never had the opportunity to experience the nation freed from the strain of war. Many important political developments had transpired in his absence. On November 25, 1783, the British finally evacuated New York City. The following day, Washington led a triumphal procession through the streets of Manhattan. Then, on December 4th, Washington gathered his officers together and announced his intention to retire. One eyewitness, the future Chief Justice John Marshall, wrote an account of the scene, quote, with a heart full of love and gratitude, Washington said, lifting a glass to toast them, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable. Having drunk, he added, I cannot come to each of you to take my leave, but I shall be obliged if each of you come and take me by the hand. General Knox, being nearest, turned to him. Washington, incapable of utterance, grasped his hand and embraced him. In the same affectionate manner he took his leave of each succeeding officer. The tear of manly sensibility was in every eye, and not a word was articulated to interrupt the dignified silence and tenderness of that moment. End quote. Later that month, Washington handed in his ceremonial sword and commission papers to Congress, thereby formally resigning his post as Commander-in-Chief. Having led his men to victory in the War of Independence and with peace at last secured, General Washington had made the decision to lay down his arms and return quietly to civilian life. Writing to Lafayette in February 1784, he reported, with no small degree of pleasure, quote, At length, my dear Marquis, I have become a private citizen on the banks of the Potomac River, and under the shadow of my own vine and my own fig tree, free from the bustle of camp and the busy scenes of public life. I solace myself with these tranquil enjoyments, of which the soldier ever in pursuit of fame, the statesman whose watchful days and sleepless nights are spent in devising schemes to promote the welfare of his own, and the courtier who is always watching the countenance of his prince in the hopes of catching a gracious smile, can have very little conception. I am retired not only from all public enjoyments, but I am retiring within myself, and shall be able to view the solitary walk and tread the paths of private life with heartfelt satisfaction. Envious of none, I am determined to be pleased by all. And this, my dear friend, being the order for my march, will move gently down the stream of life until I join my fathers." End quote. Lafayette was astonished by Washington's decision. Despite being in a position where he could have retained his political and military power in the early years of this new republic, Washington had declined to do so. His conduct immediately drew comparisons to a figure from ancient Roman history, Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a statesman of the Roman Republic who in 485 BC left behind a quiet life on his farm to assume dictatorial control over the Republic during a period of crisis, as allowed by Roman law. After having successfully led the Republic through said crisis, Cincinnatus voluntarily relinquished his powers and once more returned to his farm. Comparisons of Washington to Cincinnatus were so prevalent that, following Washington's resignation, a group of war veterans, centered around then-Secretary of War Henry Knox, founded a new fraternal organization dubbed the Society of the Cincinnati, with Washington designated as the Society's first president. The founding statement of the Society reads as follows, quote, "To inculcate to the latest age the duty of laying down in peace arms which had been assumed for public defense, by forming an institution that recognizes that most important principle, to continue the mutual friendships which commenced under the pressure of common danger, and to effectuate the acts of beneficence dictated by the spirit of brotherly kindness towards those officers and their families." End quote. Membership in the society was hereditary, and restricted to officers of the Continental Army or Navy who had served for at least 3 years. Knox invited Lafayette to join and to organize a French branch of the society. This Lafayette did with the utmost enthusiasm. He managed to convince many of his friends and compatriots from the war, including Rochambeau, Ségur, Noailles, and D'Estaing, to join, and he personally paid over 20,000 livres to a Parisian jeweler to create medallions for the society's members in both France and the United States. Although Washington and his Cincinnatus-like conduct were universally respected, the Society of the Cincinnati proved to be controversial. It drew criticism in equal measure from veterans of lower rank who were not allowed admittance, and prominent politicians who had concerns about the implications of such an organization. Both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson voiced their opposition to the creation of the society, with Jefferson writing in a letter to Washington that, quote, "It is against the Confederation, against the letter of some of our laws, and against the spirit of all of them, because the foundation upon which these are built is the natural equality of man, the denial of every preeminence but that annexed to legal office, and particularly the denial of a preeminence based on birth." End quote. Lafayette tried to defend both himself and the society from accusations that the society was some sort of attempt to replicate European feudalism, offering his assurances in a letter to Adams that, quote, "My principles have ever been against heredity." End quote. Criticism like this was so widespread that Washington, the society's first president, seriously considered disbanding it altogether. This he did not do, although he did vote in favor of abolishing the heredity rule. It's worth noting, however, that after the controversy surrounding the society died down, the heredity rule was quietly reintroduced, and the society still exists at the time of writing this script. In June 1784, Lafayette departed the French city of Brest aboard a ship named the Courrier de New York, one of the first commercial vessels that regularly carried passengers from France to the United States. He arrived in New York City on August 4th. This was, it's worth noting, his first time setting foot in the city ever. Captured by the British early in the War of Independence, for the entire time that Lafayette had served in the Continental Army, New York City had remained a bastion of British rule, the nerve center of their political and military operations in North America. Throughout the war, the city had been home to thousands of Loyalist refugees, fugitive slaves who threw in their lot with the British to secure emancipation, and most Continental Army prisoners of war, who were detained aboard overcrowded and disease-ridden prison ships in the harbor. Long anticipated to be the site of the war's final battle, during the Virginia campaign, Lafayette had been incredibly anxious to participate in the final reckoning that he was certain was to take place there. Now, 3 years later, Lafayette was, to paraphrase historian Harlow Giles Unger, finally able to conquer New York City, in a sense. Unger describes the rapturous ovation he received upon his arrival. Quote, "Cannons boomed, church bells rang, bands blared, and thousands cheered as his open carriage displayed him to the city, escorted by a smartly dressed cavalry troop, their swords drawn in honor of their former general. Flags and buntings flew from every building. Men, women, and children squeezed through windows to see him, cheer for him and cry out to him by the only name they had ever known him by, Marquis, 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 end quote. Lafayette spent 2 days in New York, catching up with some old friends and even an old rival, General Horatio Gates. Evidently, the two men had agreed to forget the whole business with Thomas Conway and his alleged involvement in the scheme to stage a coup against Washington. Gates, who moved to Manhattan after the war, took Lafayette on a sightseeing tour, even complimenting the Marquis for having become more mature since they had last seen each other. From New York, Lafayette went to Philadelphia, with crowds turning out to greet him at each town along the way. Lafayette was rather touched by the sights and sounds of his adoptive country now at peace, as he wrote in a letter to his wife, Adrienne, quote, "Every step I take in this country brings me new joys. The nation is happy, peaceful, and prosperous. The houses that I once saw burnt are now rebuilt, abandoned properties are now reoccupied, and everything seems to be on the way to complete recovery. I can only hope that my presence here will be useful in promoting the domestic interests of the United States and the union that must reign between them." End quote. Lafayette spent a week in Philadelphia, reuniting with more of his wartime compatriots and interacting with the political elite of the fledgling nation's capital. On August 17th, Lafayette arrived at his main destination, Mount Vernon, the estate of his beloved General Washington. Finally reunited with Washington after the better part of 3 years, Lafayette was overcome with emotion, as he described in a letter back home. Quote, "I had to write to you of my arrival at Mount Vernon and the joy that I felt at seeing my dear general again. You know me too well for me to have to describe my feelings. I found him on his farm, where our meeting was deeply moving and equally joyful for us both." End quote. Lafayette spent the next 10 days in the warm embrace of Washington's household. In another letter back home, he outlined the itinerary of the days he spent there. Quote, "Washington, in retirement, is even greater than he was during the Revolution. His simplicity is truly sublime, and he is deeply involved in the details of managing his lands and home as if he had always been there. To give you an idea of how we spend our time, after lunch, the General and I chat for a while, and after thoroughly discussing the past, the state of things today, and the outlook for the future, he retired to take care of his business and gives me things to read that were written in my absence. Then we go down to dinner with Mrs. Washington and the neighbors. The table conversation inevitably turns to the events of the war and anecdotes that we like to remember. After tea, we resume our private conversations and spend the rest of the evening with the family. That, my sweetheart, is how we spend our time. We often speak of you, our children, and everything else that is to do with our family. I made a solemn vow, my sweetheart, to bring you along with me on the next trip. Mount Vernon stands on the most beautiful site. It is as though the Potomac was created for it. The house is beautiful and the countryside is most charming." End quote. In these and other descriptions he wrote about his time there, Lafayette painted a vivid picture of Mount Vernon as an isolated and idyllic rural estate. And while this may well have been the way that he experienced it, it should be noted that at the time Mount Vernon was still a fully functional commercial enterprise consisting of 5 separate farms spread out across nearly 8,000 acres of land on which 200 enslaved people worked. Washington was a firm proponent of the notion that the economic and moral value of a nation was directly tied to the ability of its people to effectively utilize its land, and as such, he was constantly engaged in the management of his grounds, always seeking to experiment with new agricultural tools and practices to maximize productivity. In the mornings they spent together, Washington took Lafayette along with him on his daily surveys of his grounds, during which time Lafayette would have had the opportunity to see firsthand the day-to-day operations of such a large agricultural enterprise. This experience did have the effect of inculcating in Lafayette a keen interest in agriculture, which he would maintain for the rest of his life. Of course, given his feelings on the institution of slavery as we discussed earlier, it seems unlikely that he would have been able to prevent himself from broaching the subject with Washington. Although there is no record of it, it is very possible that at this time Lafayette once again proposed to Washington his scheme of gradual emancipation he first mentioned in his correspondence a year prior. In addition to the fact that his livelihood was entirely dependent on slave labor, Washington was all too aware of the fact that the issue of slavery was just one of the many factors that had been generating tensions between the states of the nascent Union. As of 1784, 2 states, Vermont and Massachusetts, had abolished slavery outright, while several other northern states had begun to phase out slavery through gradual emancipation. At the same time, in the southern states, the economies of which were to a large degree reliant on slave labor, there was widespread and vehement opposition to even gradual emancipation. Indeed, of all the issues which divided the states in this formative period of the Republic, the issue of slavery was at the forefront. And not to get too off topic, it would be the primary cause of the eventual Civil War some 77 years or so down the line. Although we don't know for certain whether Lafayette discussed the topic with Washington in person at Mount Vernon, there are 2 documented instances of him publicly addressing the issue during his 1784 visit. Lafayette knew that he commanded the respect of the general public in all states, and he hoped that this might help him to pressure at least one state, Virginia, to move towards emancipation. Here, Lafayette was perhaps being naive, but not completely so. He would have had some reason to believe that this could be accomplished. 2 years prior, the Virginia state legislature had passed an act officially named the Act to Authorize the Manumission of Slaves. To summarize, this law allowed any slaveholder to manumit, that is to say, free, any slave that they owned at will without having to seek government approval. Many Virginians thought the act was too radical, a precursor to total abolition and emancipation. On November 16th, Lafayette appeared before the Virginia state legislature to formally accept their thanks for his conduct in the Yorktown campaign 3 years prior. He took the opportunity to deliver a passionate plea to the delegates to end slavery, because in so doing they would, quote, continue to provide the world with unquestionable proof of their philanthropy and their regard for the liberties of all mankind, end quote. At this time, though, the Virginia delegates were under intense public pressure to repeal the Manumission Law of 1782. That very month, they'd received no fewer than 8 different petitions demanding that the law be repealed. One of these stated that, quote, many evils have arisen from it, end quote. Never one to be discouraged, Lafayette stayed in the state capital of Richmond for some time, engaging in whatever anti-slavery efforts he could. On November 21st, he put before the state legislature a written testimonial supporting the petition of a slave named James Armistead to gain his freedom. Armistead is someone that I really should have introduced in the previous episode, but there was so much else that I had to cover there was really no good opportunity for it. So to right this wrong, I'll do it now. James Armistead was an enslaved man, either 33 or 45 years old as of 1781, since the year of his birth is alternatively listed in the sources as either 1748 or 1760 for some reason. His owner was William Armistead, a Virginia planter who worked as a contractor for the Virginia State Militia. His previous owner, William's father John, taught James how to read and write, a rarity among American slaves. When the war broke out and Armistead expressed his desire to help the American cause by acting as a double agent, his owner granted this request. During the Yorktown campaign, Armistead infiltrated Benedict Arnold's camp, posing as a fugitive slave, and passed along intel about British troop movements to Lafayette. After Arnold was relieved of duty, he continued to spy on his replacement, Lord Cornwallis, and it was thanks to him that Lafayette learned that the British intended to fortify Yorktown, thereby setting the stage for the climactic final battle. As Lafayette put it in his testimony, Armistead, quote, rendered essential services unto me when he industriously collected intelligence from the enemy camp. He had perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him, and appears to me to be entitled to every reward that his situation can admit of, end quote. In recognition of his contributions to the war, William attempted to free James under the 1782 Manumission Law, but due to a legal technicality, he remained his master's property. It wouldn't be for another 3 years before the Virginia state legislature finally granted Armistead his freedom. Armistead credited Lafayette's testimony with influencing their decision, and he subsequently adopted the surname Lafayette, in honor of the man who had changed his life in such a profound way. From Virginia, Lafayette went back to New York City, where he was formally declared a, quote, freeman and citizen of the city of New York, end quote. This was the first of many similar honors that he would receive in the following weeks, as from that point forward, practically every state and municipal government raced to confer honorary citizenship upon the Frenchman. The first state to do so was that of Maryland on December 28, 1784. The official text of the proclamation read in part, quote, the Marquis de Lafayette and all his male heirs shall forever be, and each of them hereby deemed to be natural-born citizens of the state, and shall henceforth be entitled to all communities, rights, and privileges of a natural-born citizen thereof, end quote. At this time, this would have only made Lafayette a citizen of just the state of Maryland and not of the United States as a whole. But with the ratification of the Constitution 4 years later, the notion of citizenship was redefined, and all citizens of the individual states were granted reciprocal citizenship in each of the others. So, when Lafayette was declared a natural-born citizen of the state of Maryland in 1784, He became, for all intents and purposes, a natural-born citizen of the United States of America. While Lafayette was in New York City, Congress appointed a new commission for a diplomatic mission to the Iroquois Confederacy. In the third episode of this series, we talked a bit about the history of the Iroquois, the role that they played in the Revolutionary War, and the efforts of Lafayette and others to win them over to the Patriot cause. To briefly recap that discussion, the Iroquois were a powerful confederacy of 6 tribes in northwestern New York: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. The Iroquois were a regional power, often playing the British and French against one another to their advantage. Historically, they had been adversarial toward the British, but when the War of Independence broke out, they largely sided with them against the colonists, whose expansionist tendencies they feared. Of the colonial powers, the Iroquois had historically been most well disposed towards the French, and it was precisely for this reason that Lafayette had been selected to engage in diplomacy with them 6 years prior, during the winter of 1778. Although he made a good impression on a personal level, his pleas for the Iroquois to throw in their lot with the Americans went unheeded. Of the 6 nations that comprised the Confederacy, 4 actively fought on the side of the British, while the remaining 2 opted to maintain their official stance of neutrality. Now that the war was over, the Americans sought to reconcile with the Iroquois and to establish peace between themselves and the 6 nations. Lafayette jumped at this opportunity to lend his services to the United States, and given his previous contact with the Iroquois, he volunteered to accompany this new commission into their territory to help them negotiate a settlement. On this mission, Lafayette was joined by 2 new companions, the French diplomat François de Barbé-Marbois and the future United States President James Madison. Marbois was the secretary of the French legation to the United States and had served in that capacity for 5 years. Marbois was a meticulous note-taker who sought to compile all the information he could regarding the geography, history, and politics of each of the 13 states. To this end, he had sent out a questionnaire to each of the states' governors. The reply of Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson would eventually serve as the basis for his book, Notes on the State of Virginia. That said, Marbois' writings by themselves offer some interesting insights into various aspects of early American society. James Madison is most famous for the role that he played in the creation of the United States Constitution and for serving as the 4th President of the United States, but both of these achievements were still years away. At this time, the 33-year-old Madison was still a protege of his elder colleague, Thomas Jefferson, but he had already begun to establish a political career of his own, having previously served in both the Virginia state legislature and in the Continental Congress. Madison was one of the politicians with whom Lafayette had mingled and consorted with during his stay in Philadelphia earlier that year, and although they had both initially become acquainted with each other during the war, it was not until recently that the 2 men became close, hence why Madison volunteered to join Lafayette on this mission. The journey from New York City to the meeting ground at Fort Stanwix, which stood near the center of the current-day city of Rome, New York, was a rather arduous trek, over 200 miles of less than hospitable terrain. The first leg of the journey from New York City to Albany was pleasant enough. From there, however, Marbois described how the second half of the journey descended into a grueling ordeal. Quote, "This barbarous and savage journey made us abandon our carriage and to force our horses through the narrow woods, following as best we could a footpath made by the savages who always travel on foot. The streams form a contentious and boggy swamp into which we sank at every step. Trees of immense height and girth fall from old age and make the path difficult for us on horseback. We were lost for a time, but our guide soon found the way again." End quote. Despite these conditions, Marbois remarked that Lafayette, quote, "appeared to be impervious to the heat, cold, drought, moisture, and general intemperance of the weather." End quote. As a veteran of the Continental Army who had survived the infamous winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, Lafayette had already experienced the North American climate at its most harsh and intemperate. It also helped that he was the only one who had the foresight to bring along clothing appropriate for the weather. During their journey, Lafayette had ample time to make conversation with his traveling companions. In a dispatch to Jefferson, Madison wrote about Lafayette's hobby horses, 3 particular topics that he talked about frequently and at great length. Quote, "The first is the alliance between France and the United States, the second is the union of the latter, and the third is the manumission of slaves." End quote. The first topic, the Franco-American alliance, is something that we've talked about at great length in this series already. As one of the individuals most singularly responsible for bringing this alliance into being, Lafayette had a clearly vested interest in maintaining cordial relations between France and the United States, and in promoting American interests in France, as evidenced most recently by his lobbying efforts on behalf of American merchants in Paris and by the publication of his pamphlet advocating the breakdown of trade barriers between the two nations. Suffice it to say that Lafayette's thoughts and feelings on the alliance between France and the United States should already be apparent by this point. As for his beliefs surrounding the issue of slavery, I have spoken about this at great length in this episode already, but one point that I haven't yet mentioned is that from the moment that he decided to take up the cause of abolitionism after the war, he continued to advocate for it strongly throughout the years, which demonstrates that these beliefs, despite appearing to have sprung up rather suddenly, were nonetheless deeply held. Another interesting facet of this issue is that Lafayette continued to maintain close friendships with some of the largest slaveholders in the United States. For their part, these men, like Washington and Jefferson, did not seem to resent Lafayette for his abolitionist views. If anything, it seems they admired him for his convictions. Madison, who was himself a slave owner, wrote of Lafayette's opposition to slavery, quote, "It does him real honor, and it is proof of his humanity," end quote. Of course, none of these men, regardless of how much they may have respected Lafayette's convictions, would ever be persuaded to accept his views on the issue. There was simply too much at stake for them, both in terms of their personal fortunes and in the long-term political stability of the United States. This brings us rather conveniently to the third of Lafayette's hobby horses, the Union of the States. The relations between the individual states and the structure of the federal government is not something I've had the opportunity to discuss, but since Lafayette thought the matter to be of enough importance to discuss it so frequently with Madison, it seems appropriate to delve into the topic a bit now. Today, the structure of the United States government, that is to say, the union of the various individual states under the federal government, is something that most Americans, and even non-Americans, take for granted. As of 1784, though, the states were united in name only. At the time that they declared independence from Great Britain, the 13 colonies were each distinct political entities, with separate governments and administrative apparatuses, united only in their opposition to colonial rule. The Articles of Confederation, first drafted in 1777 and ratified 4 years later, sought to formalize the relationship between the 13 quote-unquote United States. But, far from uniting the states, the Articles of Confederation essentially rendered each of the individual states as independent nations unto themselves, with each of the state governments retaining many of the sovereign rights that usually were vested in the nation. The federal government, insofar as it existed under the Articles of Confederation, was extremely weak, with practically none of the powers that it holds today. In the absence of a strong federal government, there was no structure incentivizing the states to cooperate with each other. In this period, states frequently came into conflict with one another over matters such as borders and trade, and there was very little that the federal government could do to arbitrate these disputes. During the war, Lafayette had witnessed the ineffectiveness of this current arrangement firsthand, as exemplified by the duties that he faced in procuring military assistance from the state government of Virginia during the Yorktown campaign. More and more, Lafayette advocated for a more powerful central government, one that would actually unite the United States. Quite a few American statesmen were of a similar mind on this, most prominent among whom was his friend Alexander Hamilton. His nascent Federalist Party would eventually come to power in the 1790s. The fortunes of that party would subsequently wane, and by 1816 it would become more or less defunct, but this question of the states' relationships with each other and with the federal government was more or less the defining political issue in this early phase of the nation's history. And although it was hoped that with the ratification of the Constitution of the United States in 1788, the issue would have been definitively resolved, similar problems would continue to persist well into the next century. Anyway, I'm getting way off topic. It's time to get back to the narrative. The traveling party arrived at their destination in the final days of September 1784. Lafayette dashed off a quick letter to his wife, informing her that he now found himself, quote, in the country of savages, surrounded by Hurons and Iroquois, end quote. Not to be too pedantic, but this statement was factually incorrect. The Huron, traditionally the mortal enemies of the Iroquois, were at that time settled on the opposite shore of Lake Ontario. Marquis described the reception that they were given by the Iroquois in a way that betrayed his low opinion of them. Quote, a white flag was raised on the principal cabin, indicated to us as the council house. We found the chiefs and warriors of the nations, some 500 of them, assembled there. They received us with the hospitality that the savages showed towards all of those who were not their enemies. After the customary compliments had been exchanged, they brought to us a large salmon that they had just caught. End quote. Marquis was surprised to see the degree to which the Iroquois had adopted certain facets of Western culture, particularly regarding clothing. He seemed impressed by one chieftain who wore a nobleman's costume gifted to him by the French ambassador some years ago. Items of clothing and accessories of Western manufacture were, he observed, highly prized by them as status symbols. Attitudes among Europeans regarding Native Americans were rather diverse, perhaps more than most people think. They ranged from reverence and fascination to condescension and disdain. Oftentimes it was a mixture of these. Those invested, materially, emotionally, or otherwise, in the colonial project saw Native Americans as primitive, backwards, and inferior. This much is so obvious it should go without saying, but this was not the beginning and end of it. They saw it as their duty to spread civilization, as they conceived of it, across the entire globe. Uncivilized groups like Native Americans would be given a stark choice: either embrace Western civilization or die out along with their culture. In either case, their way of life was not long for this world. As this particularly prescient passage from Marbois' work postulates, quote, "Indeed, Europeans who are curious about them must not lose time, for the advance of the European population is extremely rapid on this continent, and since these nations live primarily by hunting and fishing, they cannot remain in the vicinity of cultivated regions. They will go further away, and soon it will be necessary to look for them beyond the Mississippi, or in the ice-covered regions around Hudson Bay. In a few centuries even, when civilization has extended its effects across the entire world, people will be tempted to read the reports of travelers as the ingenious dreams of a philosopher, seeking the origin of society, tracing the history of its advances from his imagination." End quote. Further on in this same tract, Marbois envisions what the terrain of upstate New York that he currently observed around him would be transformed into in due course. Quote, "In a century, perhaps sooner, agriculture and commerce will give life to this savage desert. This rock will furnish stones to the city that will be built on the banks of that stream. There will be a bridge here and a quay there. Instead of this marsh, there will be a public fountain. Elegantly dressed ladies will stroll in the park in the very places where I now tread carefully for fear of rattlesnakes. It will be a public park, adorned with statues and fountains. A few ancient trees will be exhibited as the precious remains of the forest which today covers the mountain. I already see the square where the college, the academy, the house for the municipal legislature, and other various public buildings will be placed. Do not take this for a dream, for practically every city on this continent had, 100 years ago, no more existence than the one that I've just described." End quote. Marbois and those of a similar mind saw absolutely nothing of value in the indigenous way of life, but again, this was not representative of the entire breadth of European thought regarding this subject. More liberal-minded Europeans understood the Native Americans through the paradigm of the noble savage, ultimately regarding Native American civilization as being in an advanced state with many of the same connotations, but at the same time believing that by virtue of not being an advanced civilization, they retained a slate of positive qualities, such as, in the words of author Laura Auricchio, quote, "good faith, mutual trust, and selfless benevolence." End quote. By modern standards, the noble savage stereotype is understood to be problematic for several reasons, regardless of how well-intentioned its proponents may have been. As a student of the Enlightenment, Lafayette's own views and attitudes towards the Native Americans would have been influenced by this concept, and as such characterized by a sort of well-meaning but ultimately injurious paternalism. As I touched on when we discussed his first interactions with the Iroquois in 1778, Lafayette very much believed the notion that Native Americans were, by their nature, a freedom-loving and egalitarian-minded race of people, with an innate understanding of concepts like liberty that Europeans had long since forgotten the meaning of and were just now beginning to rediscover. He did not understand why the revolutionary cause of the United States had failed to win over a decisive mass of the natives, failing to consider that there were other more tangible factors that they had taken into consideration, that perhaps their understanding of the situation was more sophisticated than most would be willing to give them credit for. The conference officially opened the following day. The head of the U.S. delegation, Oliver Wolcott, allowed Lafayette, though not an official member of the commission, to deliver opening remarks. Calling the Marquis by his ceremonial Iroquois name, Keula, Wolcott introduced him in the following manner. Quote, "He is a great man among the French, one of the head warriors of the great Onondaga, and, as you all know, a general in the American army and a head man among us. He comes here with his friends to pay you a visit and to offer you the advice of a father." End quote. This Onondaga figure that Wolcott referenced was a title used by speakers of Iroquoian languages to refer to the King of France. Lafayette would also go out of his way to include several references to local folklore in his speech, which reads to modern audiences as a bit insincere but was evidently well received by those present. Unlike the conference in 1778, this time Lafayette's speech was fortunately recorded for posterity. After giving proper thanks to the Great Spirit for bringing him there, Lafayette reminded the Assembly of his past visit, apparently restating a passage from the speech he had originally given to them 6 years prior. At that time, he had exhorted the Iroquois leaders to join the American cause, as it was a righteous one and aligned with their own values. At the very least, if they maintained their neutrality, he promised them that, quote, "The brave Americans will defend your liberty. The white ships will come, and they will cover the shores of the great island. The great Onondio, like the sun, will disperse the clouds that hang over your heads, and the schemes of your enemies will vanish like smoke." End quote. After reminding them of his past message, Lafayette turned to current events. Quote, "Peace has been made, and you know its conditions. What I predicted having come to pass, now hear Keula's new advice, and may my voice ring out among the nations like the voice of the salutary wind, the forerunner of rain. What, my children, have you ever gained from espousing the quarrels of the white man? Be wiser than the pale-faces, and, because the Great Council of the United States is ready to treat with you, take advantage of its goodwill. Keep the peace among yourselves and trade with the Americans, for such trade will become for you the sign of a new alliance." End quote. The assembled chieftains, 40 in total, each responded in turn, thanking him for his words of advice, and in some cases apologizing for having failed to heed his words in the past. A Mohawk chieftain named Oxian Chiu addressed him, quote, "My father, we have heard your words, and rejoice that you have visited your children to give them your wise advice. You have done us much good, and we sense that your words are those of truth. They will strengthen the chain of friendship that we hope will live on forever." End quote. The chief then presented Lafayette with a necklace that had once been given to him decades ago by Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, the French general whom the British defeated at Quebec during the 7 Years' War. Lafayette displayed the necklace to the assembly and, properly thanking the chief, then placed it back around his neck. According to Madison, Lafayette's gesture had the effect of making him, quote, "the only conspicuous figure there," end quote. Referring to the 3 commissioners appointed by Congress, Madison went on, quote, "They were, at that moment, eclipsed. All of them probably felt it. One of them, Lee, complained to me about the immoderate stress laid on the influence of the Marquis," end quote. Marbois marveled at how, quote, "the Marquis has their confidence and devotion to an extraordinary degree. Those who have seen him before now clamor to see him again. They have communicated their enthusiasm to their friends, and they seem proud to wear around their necks some trinket or other that he once gave them." End quote. The conference concluded on October 6th, after which Lafayette and company departed for Boston. The Marquis was confident in the belief that he had helped to broker a strong and durable peace between the United States and the Iroquois Confederacy. As he wrote to Adrienne, quote, "They have made great promises, and I like to think that I have contributed to a treaty that will secure for us a stream of commerce, and will ensure the tranquility of the Americans." End quote. Later that month, on October 22nd, 1784, representatives of the United States and the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy signed a formal agreement, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the second treaty by that name. The treaty did reestablish peace between the 2 parties, but overall its terms were decidedly unfavorable to the Iroquois, as it compelled them to relinquish claims to a sizable amount of territory in western New York and Pennsylvania. This dealt a significant blow to the Confederacy, weakened already by the war and divided among themselves regarding their attitudes towards the Americans. Their fortunes would never recover, and thousands were dispossessed of their land as a result of this treaty and subsequent ones. There's no reason to believe that this outcome was what Lafayette had desired, and in fact every statement that he made on the matter suggests that he genuinely believed that the Iroquois, and perhaps the Native Americans in general, could forge a peaceful and mutually beneficial coexistence with the United States. Relations between the United States and the various tribes of Native Americans that stood between them and westward expansion would for the next century be defined by near ceaseless hostility. That Lafayette earnestly hoped, or perhaps even believed, that things might have turned out differently is a rather telling example of his naivete. When parting with Lafayette following the end of the conference, Madison offered the following assessment of him, quote, "I take him to be as amiable as his vanity will admit, and as sincere an American as any Frenchman could possibly be." End quote. As proof of his benevolent intentions towards his proverbial native children, at one point Lafayette offered to take a literal native child, technically an adolescent, with him to France, where he would live in his own household. The adolescent in question was named Peter Ostiquette, the son of a French father and an Oneida mother, who was at that time probably around 17 years old. I say probably because there is little concrete information about him. Practically all we know of his early life comes to us by way of correspondence between Lafayette and Jeremiah Wadsworth, a Connecticut-based merchant and statesman who made the arrangements for Ostiquette's transit to Europe. I should note that, as unusual as this may sound to modern listeners, arrangements like this were not that uncommon at the time, and there was nothing overtly nefarious about it. There is a long history of European benefactors, typically Catholic missionaries, sending Native American children to Europe to be educated. More often than not, their families were more than willing to consent to this, with the thought that when the boy was returned to his people, he would do so armed with the knowledge of the Europeans and their customs that would allow him to negotiate more effectively with the white men on their behalf. In this particular case, the only thing that struck Lafayette as unusual was the insistence of Ostachet's family that his departure should be delayed for at least a year. When Lafayette did set out for Europe a few months later, though, he took along with him an entirely different Native American boy, about whom we know even less. Most biographies of Lafayette omit any mention of him entirely. What we do know is that his name was Canlaha and that he belonged to the Onondaga Nation. He was a fair bit younger than Ostachet, between 12 and 14 years old. The few sources that do mention Canlaha are not in agreement as to whether he was sent at the behest of his parents or if he was an orphan. Upon returning to France in 1785, Lafayette brought Canlaha with him to live at his house at 81 Rue de Bourbon. Adrienne, to her credit, did not resent this new addition to their household. The two of them ensured that the Onondaga boy was fed, clothed, sheltered, and otherwise cared for. They put him to work around the house with various chores and errands, and when he was not busy, they saw to it that he received regular tutoring in literature, history, math, and both the French and English languages. Although he was not probably acting from cruel motives, Lafayette did often treat his young ward as a curiosity, another America-themed souvenir to round out his collection. He was in the habit of presenting the boy during social calls, having him perform something called a tomahawk dance for guests, fully dressed in his native garb. John Ledyard, an American explorer who was a frequent guest at Lafayette's house, reported, quote, "The Marquis has as a page boy an Indian, whom he has at his own expense, equipped with rich Indian dresses." End quote. Another account of Canlaha's time at Chez Lafayette comes to us from the memoirs of a French nobleman named Achille Charles, Comte de Neuilly, who reported that, quote, "In his company was a savage whom he had brought from America, a real tamed animal with a ring in his nose, a bone placed so as to hang from his ear, legs and arms tattooed, a feathered headdress on his head, and the whole costume consisting of a belt and feathers over a flesh-colored tunic." End quote. It's worth noting that Neuilly was a child at the time of this encounter and was writing decades later. But one thing that both he and other observers found remarkable is the fact that Canlaha always referred to Lafayette as his father. Canlaha left France sometime between late 1786 and early 1787, and promptly disappears from the historical record afterwards, at least as far as I've been able to tell. Before we move on with the narrative, and I apologize for the lengthy digression, I'd like to talk a bit more about Peter Ostachet, since his story is quite interesting, and I don't think we'll have another good opportunity to talk about him going forward. Whatever complications Lafayette had run into while trying to secure permission from Ostachet's family seems to have been resolved after about 6 months or so. In a letter to Jeremiah Wadsworth, dated April 16, 1785, Lafayette reported that an agreement regarding the boy had been reached, and that he should be sent to France as soon as Wadsworth was able to make the arrangements. Most likely, Ostachet arrived in France sometime around October 1785, and he stayed there for a little under 3 years. During this time, he stayed at Lafayette's Parisian residence as well, and was treated similar to Canlaha, given a full private education while also fulfilling the duties of a favored servant, as Lafayette himself phrased it. From a handful of clothing receipts mentioning Ostachet by name that were found amidst Lafayette's papers, it can be observed that he had him dressed in an eclectic mixture of Native American and European fashions, perhaps reflecting Ostachet's own mixed heritage. Remember, he was half French. His partial European ancestry probably also spared him from the indignity of becoming a public spectacle like Canlaha. In general, his time in France was unremarkable, but upon his return to America in 1788, Ostachet began to attract public attention, a result of the American people's enduring captivation with the Marquis. An article published in the Massachusetts Sentinel regarding Ostachet reported, quote, "This young aboriginal was sent to Paris by that benevolent nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette, for the purpose of receiving the first principles of a European education." End quote. The author of this article erroneously claims that prior to his stay in France, Ostachet was, quote, "in a wholly nude and uncivilized state." End quote. Now, however, the author found him to be, quote, "a highly cultivated man, a master of the French language. His manners are elegant and refined, and his intellect is quick and penetrating." End quote. This article was reprinted in a few different publications across the northeastern United States. Hachette made a similarly favorable impression on many other people that he met in America at this time. A young woman from a well-to-do family in Philadelphia, who briefly made his acquaintance, wrote this passage in her journal about Hachette. Quote, "At first, I was very much afraid of him, but as it turned out, he was the most agreeable of the company. After breakfast, the Indian chief played several tunes on his clarinet, and he played very well. His observations are just, and his manners are very agreeable. He also gave to us a very entertaining account of the manners and customs of his own nation. In short, he's quite accomplished. We sent an invitation to the prince to come and dine with us. He came dressed in a scarlet coat trimmed with gold lace. He really did make a good figure. After dinner, I danced a cotillion with him. He dances by far the best of any person I ever saw attempt it." End quote. The United Nations intended to make good use of Hachette's quick wit and refined manners. In March 1792, he was sent to Philadelphia as part of an Iroquois delegation that met with President Washington. Tragically, Peter Hachette died on that very same trip, no older than 25 years old. He was buried in a local cemetery with military honors. Officially, the cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but a friend of Hachette's, a Dutch immigrant living in upstate New York named Francis van der Kamp, suspected that alcoholism may have been to blame. Reflecting on Native American-European relations, van der Kamp mused, quote, "It may be justly questioned if their vicinity to their white neighbors is to them rather a curse than it is a blessing. How contrary this all is with the genuine spirit of Christianity." End quote. Returning to the narrative now, as I said, after the conference at Fort Stanwix concluded in early October 1784, Lafayette proceeded to Boston. At the time of his arrival there, the city was still amid celebrations commemorating the anniversary of the surrender at Yorktown. A parade was held in his honor, and crowds of people from across the city congregated to catch a glimpse of the conqueror of Cornwallis. Lafayette was treated to the usual accompaniment of parades, banquets, balls, and other various festivities. Following the lead of other states that Lafayette had visited during this time, the Massachusetts State Assembly declared him a citizen, and Harvard University awarded him an honorary degree. Lafayette spent the next 2 weeks touring the states of New England, being feted by every town that he stopped in. In early November, Lafayette traveled from Boston to Virginia via ship. It was at this time that Lafayette addressed the state legislature there on the issue of slavery and offered his assistance to James Armistead in securing his freedom, as I described earlier. I do apologize for the disjointed chronology of this episode, but it did make more sense to organize it thematically. After this, Lafayette returned to tour the site of his greatest triumph, the battlefield at Yorktown, before heading back to Mount Vernon to spend more time with his beloved general. Lafayette and Washington passed another week with each other in much the same way as they had earlier that year. Lafayette was sad to tear himself away from this idyllic revelry, but, alas, he had obligations to return to back in France. Washington accompanied Lafayette as far as Annapolis before they finally bade each other farewell on the 1st of December, 1784. Both men were so overcome with emotion that neither was able to speak. All they could do was embrace each other wordlessly before parting ways. Lafayette stopped in Philadelphia on his way back to New York City, where he gave a brief address before Congress, expressing his high hopes for the nation's future. Quote, "May this immense temple of freedom ever stand as a lesson to oppressors, an example of the oppressed, and a sanctuary for the rights of all mankind." End quote. As a parting gift, Congress presented him with one of the battle standards surrendered by Cornwallis at Yorktown. Lafayette continued on to New York City, where his departure was delayed by a week as the ship that he was meant to travel aboard was undergoing repairs. Two of his comrades from the war, Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox, had come to see him off, and, after meeting up with Alexander Hamilton, they all passed the time in prolonged conversations, reminiscing about the war and speaking of the future. Lafayette told them that he wished to send his son, George Washington, to the United States to receive an education at Harvard University. He suggested that if Greene, Knox, or Hamilton sent their sons to do the same at the Sorbonne in Paris, he would be happy to offer them room and board. None of their children were quite of age at that moment, but one of them mentioned that they knew of a 14-year-old orphan named John Edwards Caldwell, the son of a Presbyterian chaplain who had been killed during the war. They asked Lafayette if he could take this boy with him to France to receive an education, and Lafayette was more than happy to oblige. On December 21st, Lafayette was escorted to the docks by a large coterie of dignitaries, including the French consul, Jean de Crèvecoeur, and New York Governor George Clinton, along with his friends Hamilton, Greene, and Knox. After bidding farewell to each of them in turn, Clinton handed Lafayette a letter from Washington, written upon his return to Mount Vernon. It read, Quote, "My dear Marquis, in the moment of our separation on the road as I traveled, and every hour since, I have felt only love, respect, and attachment for you, which the length of years has inspired me with. I asked myself as our carriages diverged whether this would be the last sight I shall ever have of you, and though I wished to say no, my fears answered yes. I persuade myself to repeat to you, my dear Marquis, the sincerity of my regard and friendship. Nor have I words that could express my affection for you were I to attempt it. My fervent prayers are offered for your safe and pleasant passage, happy meeting with Madame Lafayette and family, and the completion of every wish of your heart." End quote. Washington was not simply being melodramatic for its own sake. He was 52 years old, which, while not exactly elderly, still meant that the days of his youth were firmly behind him, and the stresses of leading the nation were not making him any younger. Given that his father and grandfather both died before their 50th year, Washington had every reason to believe that he was living on borrowed time. Lafayette, however, would hear none of this, hurriedly dashing off a response before the ship left the harbor. Quote, "No, my dear General, our recent separation will not be a final adieu. My soul revolts at this idea, and if I could for an instant even entertain this idea, in truth it would make me absolutely miserable. It is with an inexpressible pain that I will be separated from you by the ocean. Everything that admiration, respect, gratitude, friendship, and filial piety can inspire is combined in my affectionate heart most tenderly to you. In your friendship I find a delight which words cannot express. Farewell, my dear General. It is not without emotion that I write these words, although I know that I shall visit you again." End quote. Still young and full of vigor, Lafayette envisioned himself visiting America on a semi-regular basis in the future. But as it turned out, Washington's premonitions were correct. The next time Lafayette would set foot in America, it would be 1824. Washington would be long since dead, and the 67-year-old Lafayette, while still beloved as ever, was a hero of a bygone age. It was not a lack of desire that prevented Lafayette from visiting his adoptive country, but matters of political exigency. The next 4 decades would be a tumultuous time in the history of France, and Lafayette would find himself inexorably involved in these epical events. And so, in the next episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, we will finally begin our narrative of the French Revolution. So please tune in again in 2 weeks as we move on to the next chapter of our story. As always, any and all questions, comments, concerns, or anything else you'd like to bring to my attention can be directed to my email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. I can also be reached by Twitter, Facebook, and the show's website. Links to all of these will be in the episode description. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting me by purchasing some used books on eBay. A link to the store page will also be in this episode's description. Anyway, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.
Ça ira, réjouissons